which demonstrates the way the men viewed the women in this time period. However, their obedience to their men reinforces the perception of their weakness. The men appear to be superior to the women because of their wealth. The women allow themselves to be persuaded by this wealth, which signifies their weakness and an unimportance to the men because they can be so easily tossed away.
Thank you, Marbelin. Our next paper is from Aviana Valdez, and her paper is titled Nick as Narrator of The Great Gatsby.
Hi, everyone. Many conflicts revolve around Nick Carraway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, including how the story is narrated. Instead of an omniscient character whereby readers might formulate their own opinions, Nick Carraway tells a story, and his biased influence, who one might say manipulates how the reader perceives a story. In the novel's opening, Nick Carraway describes his upbringing in Minnesota, stating that he learned his good morals from his father, including not being judgmental of others. Nick explains that his father told him, "Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages you've had." By opening with this statement, Nick intends for the readers to believe he can be trusted and his opinions are not biased, therefore insinuating that the story can be read without any fear of our being misguided. However, no matter how much Nick attempts to reserve all judgments, by making himself a part of the novel, judgments are made, giving the novel only one side to the story. Since many readers believe the story is only partially being told, many question Nick Carraway's narration. For example, Ken Cartwright, in his bluntly titled Nick Carraway as an Unreliable Narrator, gives a different perspective on Nick's narrations of the lives of Gatsby and the Buchanans. Cartwright believes that the setting of the first scene, which is told with great detail, is potentially not accurate because Nick may be a flawed character who is sometimes confused, misleading, or an inaccurate teller of his tale. Cartwright believes that some of the scenes may be over-exaggerated or not told in complete truthfulness because what Nick perceives may be different from what others see. For example, throughout Chapter 3, Nick describes in great detail the lavishness of Gatsby's house. Fitzgerald writes that although Nick is familiar with East End, since Daisy is his cousin, he is only a young man from Minnesota, and compared to what he is used to seeing there, Gatsby's house is much more extraordinary than those who had lived there previously. In other words, Nick may be inaccurately describing Gatsby's house, which then give readers a misleading vision of where many important scenes from the novel take place, Gatsby's home. Cartwright further criticizes Nick's way of judgmentally describing people's characters and what each of the characters stands for. Many characters may have had a distinct impact on Nick, which leads him to describing a character in a certain way. For example, when speaking to Daisy, Nick is captivated by Daisy's vibrant beauty and describes her effect on him. Her voice compelled me forward breathlessly as I listened. As Cartwright notes, Nick may have been overcome with Daisy's beauty, which can possibly be why he felt so compelled to draw near to her. Being prompted by Nick, readers are led to believe that Daisy possesses a certain charm and beauty that influence those around her. There are not many discussions related between Daisy Buchanan and the other woman in the novel, so readers do not know how female characters view her. Cartwright is correct when saying Nick's visions are limited because he fails to mention other feminine characters' interactions with Daisy. Had Nick mentioned Daisy's conversations or mannerisms with other women, we might not perceive Daisy as Nick has us see her. Lastly, Nick's view on Gatsby can be misinterpreted. After hearing the countless rumors about Gatsby from others at the party, Nick has difficulty believing what might be the truth. Later in the novel, Nick has the opportunity to learn the truth of Gatsby's life during their lunch together. When Gatsby explains his past, readers are more likely to believe his direct reported speech because it is not pieced together by Nick, but rather comes from Gatsby himself. Still, readers are influenced by the way Nick responds to some of Gatsby's stories. For example, when Gatsby tells of his life in Europe, Nick responds with trying to restrain his incredulous laughter. Nick's response suggests that Gatsby is lying, which of course influenced readers to see him in the same way. As Cartwright notes, Nick sometimes sees only part of the meaning that a scene carries, and sometimes even strange judgment. Throughout the novel, whether it is the way Nick sees the people or the environments, readers are manipulated through his point of view. Despite Nick's attempt to reserve all judgment, judgments are made, persuading readers to analyze characters or to visualize a setting in a certain ways based on Nick's point of view. By Nick Carraway not only being a narrator, but also a character in the novel, readers are limited, given biased views on characters' interactions with each other. This hinders readers' attempts to formulate their own opinion, which in turn affect how we perceive many of the conflicts in F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby.
Thank you, Aviana. Our last paper is from Luke Kwasny, and his paper is titled The Unquiet Darkness.
Hello? Are we good? Everyone can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Just a couple of prefatory remarks. This essay was originally a little bit longer than the version you're getting, so it has been shortened from an analysis of all the musical imagery that occurs throughout the entire novel into a very specific analysis of musical imagery that occurs in chapters 1 and 5, and specifically as it pertains to the characters of Daisy and Gatsby. So keep that in mind if something seems a little out of place, it's because you're getting the shortened version of it. So, The Unquiet Darkness. Given that The Great Gatsby is widely regarded as the quintessential novel of the Jazz Age, a designation which the author coined himself, it is unsurprising that Fitzgerald frequently describes his characters, their actions, and the relationships between them using musical imagery. It is through the use of this musical imagery, and furthermore, the way that this musical imagery is almost always coupled with an image of light or darkness, both of which, as symbols of obvious importance in the novel, function to compound the ambiguity surrounding a particular musical description, is that Fitzgerald connects his characters, both primary and secondary, to, or disconnects them from, the society around them, and thereby anticipates the failed romance between Daisy and Gatsby, the half-failed romance between Daisy and Tom, and the failed romance between Tom and Myrtle. But again, just Daisy and Gatsby today. Daisy's musical characteristics, which are immediately coupled with images of light, are introduced in Chapter 1, when Nick visits the Buchanan's house. Nick narrates the beginning of their first conversation in the following manner, quote, "I looked back at my cousin, who began to ask me questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was the kind of voice the ear follows up and down, as if each speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Her face was sad and lovely, with bright things in it, bright eyes and a bright, passionate mouth." This description gives the reader the impression that Daisy speaks with a voice that is beautiful for its very peculiarity. It is low and thrilling. It guides the ear up and down, and every speech is spoken in such a way that it can never be recreated in the exact same way. In short, Daisy speaks after the manner of jazz music. And it is through this likening of Daisy's voice to jazz music that Fitzgerald connects her to the society around her. Daisy's person, exemplified by something even so basic as her manner of speech, harmonizes with the jazz age. Fitzgerald's immediate description of light in the following sentence, in which the word bright appears 3 times, initially appears to resolve any ambiguity that may have surrounded Daisy's conformity to jazz age femininity. That is, to connect her jazz-like voice to her radiant aspect appears to indicate that Daisy's connection to the jazz age, forgive the joke, it was unintentional, should be taken in a positive light. However, a few pages later, Nick describes how, quote, "The last sunshine fell with romantic affection upon her glowing face. Her voice compelled me forward breathlessly as I listened. Then the glow faded, each light deserting her with lingering regret, like children leaving a pleasant street at dusk." Daisy's jazz-like voice, which Nick describes in the next paragraph as glowing and singing, is not here coupled with an image of brightness, but instead with a dim, depressing, fading light. By coupling Daisy's jazz-like voice, and thus her connection to the jazz age, with both a beautiful form of light and a damned form of light, Fitzgerald restores a sense of ambiguity to her societal connection, and this ambiguity will persist throughout the novel. At the end of Chapter 1, the reader is very briefly introduced to Gatsby's musical characteristics. Immediately before Nick sees Gatsby looking across the bay, he describes the atmosphere of the scene in the following manner, quote, "The wind had blown off, leaving a loud, bright night, with wings beating in the trees and a persistent organ sound as the full bellows of the earth blew the frogs full of life." And while this natural orchestra continues in the background, Nick describes how he, quote, "glanced seaward and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute and far away, that might have been the end of a dock. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was again alone in the unquiet darkness." The scene anticipates the incompatibility of Daisy and Gatsby's characters. That is, Gatsby does not actively contribute to the performance of this natural orchestra, and he's in fact so silent that Nick does not hear him leave, and is only surrounded by the music to which he is indifferent. Gatsby himself does not radiate light, but is merely an observer of, quote, the silver pepper of stars and the, quote, single green light across the bay. This unmusical characterization of Gatsby immediately follows the highly musical characterization of Daisy. By making Gatsby so unmusical, and the scene is only in anticipation of what follows, Fitzgerald disconnects him from the musical society around him. Jay Gatsby is a man in the Jazz Age, but not a man of the Jazz Age. And once more, by coupling this musical imagery with an image of light, makes the disconnection ambiguous. Should the reader regard Gatsby's disconnection from the Jazz Age and his consequent disconnection from Daisy in a positive or in a negative light? Excuse me while I skip ahead just a little bit from chapter 1 to chapter 5. When Daisy first arrives at Nick's house in chapter 5, Daisy's voice is described using the same sort of imagery as before. Nick notes that, quote, the exhilarating ripple of her voice was a wild tonic in the rain. I had to follow the sound of it for a moment, up and down, with my ear alone, before any words came through. However, when Gatsby enters the house, Fitzgerald deprives Daisy of her jazz-like voice and describes her manner of speech as, quote, artificial and, quote, as matter-of-fact as it could ever be. Yet this deprivation of her jazz-like voice and thus her fundamental connection to the Jazz Age is not necessarily a negative thing, since we soon read that Daisy speaks with a voice, quote, full of aching, grieving beauty, which told only of her unexpected joy. Because the reunion between Daisy and Gatsby has reconnected Daisy to a time before the Jazz Age, during which she and Gatsby were first acquainted, thus if only temporarily, Gatsby has disconnected her from the Jazz Age which surrounds her. When Nick returns to the room, he remarks that, quote, there was a change in Gatsby that was simply confounding. He literally glowed without a word or gesture of exultation, and a new well-being radiated from him and filled the little room. This is indeed simply confounding, considering that it is the only place in the entire novel where light is not external to Gatsby, but a thing highly personal. In this scene, however, Gatsby is not the only thing that radiates light. First, Nick remarks that when Gatsby, quote, realized that it had stopped raining, there were twinkle bells of sunshine in the room. He smiled like a weatherman, like an ecstatic patron of recurring light, and repeated the news to Daisy. Second, Gatsby remarks, quote, how the whole front of his house catches the light. And third, even the, quote, 2 rows of brass buttons on Daisy's dress gleamed in the sunlight. In short, everything is glowing with the light of ambiguity, except for Daisy herself. It is necessary for this reunion to be the brightest and therefore most ambiguous scene in the whole book, considering that it is the moment when Daisy must decide if she's going to attempt to reconstruct her past with Gatsby or not. Until now, Daisy has radiated light, while the possibility of love has remained ambiguous to Gatsby. But now they switch roles. Gatsby radiates light, while Daisy contemplates the possibility of loving Gatsby, of returning to the pre-Jazz Age period to which her un-Jazz-like voice has temporarily connected her.